The modern forehand that's used on the professional tours can be hit with a wide variety of grips, arm structures, different takebacks, different finishes, and even different contact heights. And when we look at the modern forehand, there are only two technical elements that are ubiquitous at the high level of the game. And number one, it starts with a loop accompanied with a non-dominant arm. So all high-level players will start the forehand with the racket up high and the non-dominant hand holding the racket. And also, all high-level forehands will have a loop. The racket will start high and with the non-dominant hand holding the racket, usually by the throat, and then as it goes back, it will drop from a high position into a low position. All high-level forehands will also make contact with the dominant shoulder in front at about 95% of the forehands. The only time this will not be the case is in emergency situations. Under normal circumstances, all high-level players will make contact with the dominant shoulder in front. And the way these two technical elements sync with each other, the holding of the racket with the loop and the dominant shoulder being in front and contact, is crucial to understand how the kinetic chain is created on the modern forehand. The reason why all high-level players have these two technical elements in common is that without them, a high-level forehand is simply impossible. So let's take a look how these two items are synced with each other. From the ready position, we're going to see that the ball is directed to our forehand, and we're simply going to turn towards that side while holding onto the racket. And now, as we are holding the racket, the tip of the racket must also be pointed towards the sky, which will give us our looping action. And now we can let go of the racket, and while we take the racket back, the non-dominant hand will stay stretched out across the body. And we can see here that the racket is going back while the non-dominant hand is still stretched out across the body. It's an important part to remember so that we don't initiate the rotation too early. So the racket is still going back, non-dominant hand is stretched out across the body. Now the next part on the forehand is ubiquitous technical element number one. This is what all high-level players have in common. Now there's differences in backswings, there's even differences in how the non-dominant arm is stretched out across the body, but all high-level players will sync this part of the forehand the same. So when the racket starts to drop, the non-dominant arm starts to go across the body. You can see here, as the racket is dropping, the non-dominant arm starts to pull away. This has to happen simultaneously. Non-dominant arm pulls out of the way while the racket starts to drop from the loop. And consequently, because we synced the forehand in this particular way, once we hit the forward phase of the stroke, which is right here, this is the butt cap pointing towards the ball, the racket is now going to be going forward. Our chest is already positioned towards the ball. And now as the upper body rotation continues, the closer we get to the ball, the more we open up, so that when we're extremely close to the ball, our chest is already parallel to the net, which will guarantee us that we'll make contact with the dominant shoulder in front. And because we're making contact with the dominant shoulder in front, this part being the ubiquitous technical element number two, now the racket has a clear path to travel across the body in a circular fashion. In other words, there's nothing in the racket's way. The body is not blocking it in any way. Naturally, this stroke turns into a circular rotational stroke. And the rotation continues until the chest is eventually pointing towards the side fence. If we put these two technical elements in context of the entire forehand swing, we can see that sequencing the torso rotation correctly is what sets high-level forehands apart. So the non-dominant arm is the first link in the chain. As it starts to pull away, the racket simultaneously starts to drop. And as we hit the forward phase, the hips start to get involved into the stroke. And as we make contact, now the legs are going to accommodate the finish, simply shifting the weight from the dominant side onto the non-dominant side. The number one forehand mistake at the recreational level by far is the dominant shoulder being behind right at the moment of contact. So at the lower recreational levels, this is an extreme case where usually players are completely sideways and they're playing the forehand like this. But even at the better recreational levels, up to 5.0 level, players will still make contact with the dominant shoulder slightly behind at contact. And the difficulty with this type of contact is that players are not exactly sure where they're making contact. So whether the dominant shoulder is slightly behind or in front. So players have to go by feel. Now you're gonna feel if you make contact with the dominant shoulder way behind. This is gonna feel terrible. But you might not necessarily feel the difference between a forehand that's struck in this manner or in this manner. You have to remember that this part of the stroke where contact is made is over in milliseconds. So the only way to achieve a proper contact on the forehand is by syncing the non-dominant arm with the racket drop correctly. And you have to be careful when you're learning the syncing of the non-dominant arm with the racket drop to time it correctly. This timing is very subtle. You can very easily start opening up too early and you end up losing the ball. So you have to remember that the stroke accelerates gradually. So when the racket is starting to drop, it's usually dropping very slowly. So you start getting that non-dominant hand out of the way very slowly also. And then as the racket starts to come down and go into the forward face, the stroke accelerates rapidly. So the mistake you have to avoid is starting to pull this arm away too quickly. Start slowly and get the racket over here, start going back, hold this position, and then as the racket drops, you slowly start coming in this way with the non-dominant arm. And then just let the acceleration of the racket take its course. As the racket accelerates, you're going to pull this arm out of the way rather quickly. And then what's going to happen as a result of that, you will be guaranteed to make contact with the dominant shoulder in front every time. How about the legs? Is the kinetic chain going from the ground up and then traveling through the hips and then through the arms and then finally into the racket? Well, it doesn't make sense because if we look at high-level forehand, we can clearly see that it's a top to bottom kinetic chain. So the first thing that starts is the letting go of the racket, and then the non-dominant hand starts to pull away while the racket drops, and now we start rotating the torso. Now the hips are usually still in place in this moment, and as the racket starts going forward, now the hips are involved. And now as we make contact, now the legs start to get involved, and we usually start to either pull back or pull to the side with the non-dominant leg to accommodate the stroke. If you did the forehand the other way, where you start getting the kinetic chain from the ground up, you will usually see something like this. The leg will spring up, and then the hips, and then the racket, and you will open up way too early, and this will look extremely rushed and hectic. This is not what a modern forehand looks like. You can clearly see that the legs always come at the end of the stroke, and that is to accommodate the finish. And just think back to how you learned the forehand. So you didn't start with the kinetic chain, you started just simply in a stationary position, swinging the racket only with the arm to get a feel for the ball. And then slowly with time, you started using your body more to accommodate the arm. And we obviously cannot play tennis without the arm. The arm is hugely important, and some people believe that the arm is swinging completely by itself. That is clearly not the case. The body is there to support the arm. Yes, a forehand or a serve or a backhand that's struck perfectly feels like we're not doing anything with the arm because the entire body is synced perfectly with the stroke. But just think, if you have an arm injury, if you have a wrist injury or an elbow injury or a shoulder injury, you are completely unable to play tennis. The arm is obviously an important piece to the forehand. And I don't want to confuse you about the legs, because the legs are possibly the most important thing when it comes to high-level tennis. Without legs, when you're playing high-level tennis, you have absolutely no chance, because number one, you will not be able to set up the ball correctly, and also you need a lot of stability when you're striking the ball. So that is something that is crucial when striking a modern forehand. You must have a lot of stability there, and I usually recommend a wider stance so we're firm to the ground and so we don't lose balance as we execute this powerful stroke. On the ATP Tour, players will usually leave the ground on the forehand, but this is not because they're jumping on their forehand, it's simply because the contact point is higher. So on the ATP Tour, there's a lot more spin, and players will make contact well above their waist, usually somewhere around their rib cage to the chest area. So what happens is they're still executing the same forehand that I just showed you. The only difference is they have to adjust for the higher ball, so they're lifting and they're doing this sinking at the same time, and the momentum of the stroke usually carries them off the ground. On the WTA Tour, on the other hand, players are still utilizing this sinking of the non-dominant arm with the racket drop, and they're also making contact with the dominant shoulder in front, but the legs are usually stuck in the ground. So in other words, they're staying low and they still have all the correct technical elements of a modern forehand. And the reason why they're playing the forehand like this is because the ball has a tendency to be lower. Balls are more flat, so they have no reason to leap off the ground, and they will very often stay low as they're executing the forehand. How can you as a recreational player learn this forehand? We have to realize that the second part is going to happen as a result of the first part. So you will make proper contact with the dominant shoulder in front if you sink the forehand correctly. So what you can do is hold the racket by the throat and start quite high. And now as the racket is starting to go back, you're going to remain in this position. You're not going to start to open up yet. And then when the racket starts to drop, you're going to start getting your non-dominant side out of the way. And you have to try to do this simultaneously. So as the racket is dropping from the loop, you then start to open up. You got to make sure that you don't open up too early. So if you open up as the racket is going back, this will open you up too soon. So you have to make sure that you hold this position for a little while, and then as you feel the racket dropping down, that's when you start opening up, and then you simply just continue to open up, and this will guarantee you that you'll make contact with the dominant shoulder in front. And I'll simply continue this rotation until your chest is pointing towards the side fence.